The other was J.J. Simler. The Vigilance Committee came about as a result of an outlaw gang led by a Santa Barbaran named Jack Powers. If I were to cast him in a movie, I would cast an Irish-American actor with a similar name, Tyrone Power. Jack Powers had been born in Hell's Kitchen, New York. His parents were Irish immigrants. He came to Santa Barbara during the Mexican War as a volunteer in an infantry regiment. He stayed, and he proved to be disgustingly good at almost everything he did. He was a graceful dancer. The women of Santa Barbara loved him. He loved horses, as the Irish do, and he loved betting on horses, as the Irish do, so that endeared him to the men of Santa Barbara. The problem was he was the leader of a gang of outlaws. His chief lieutenant in San Luis Obispo was another superb horseman. We think this is his photo. Pio Linares, his father, had once owned much of the Los Osos Valley. He sold to a Yankee. But Pio lived in this rather spacious house above San Luis Obispo High School. And the house is still there. I am told that Pio, in a way, is still there too. I have no intention of finding out. The gang left no witnesses. The robberies and murders they committed up and down our area's coast along El Camino Real became notorious. David Newsom was the first county superintendent of schools. He rode south with a companion to Santa Barbara one time, and his companion pointed out as they made their way south every spot, about as often as Anderson's pea soup signs are today, every spot where somebody had been killed by outlaws. So not even Francisco Castro could contain the Powers Linares gang. We were that dangerous, 5 sheriffs in the first 6 years of statehood. Castro walked into a card parlor on Churro Street and dragged out a murder suspect by the collar. He was a tough man. We had lots of extra-legal hangings. The only legal one was undertaken by Castro himself, of a convicted killer in the Mission Gardens. He charged the county $20. 20 years after the Vigilante Committee, he was still a tough guy. The way his life ended proved it. He got into an argument with a neighbor who threw down on him, shot Castro with his revolver. Castro drew his own revolver. It misfired. So he leaped on his assailant and beat him to death, pistol-whipped him to death with his misfired revolver. Francisco Castro died the next day. His home still stands, like Pio Linares' home. Castro's is just off Ontario Road. Obviously, it's been greatly enlarged, and I'm pretty sure that Castro did not have a satellite dish. The primary man behind the forming of the Vigilance Committee was the founder of the San Luis Obispo Tribune. Walter Murray was a young Englishman who had met a widow from Chile, or many Chilenos, in the California gold rush. The two had fallen in love and they started a family. Sadly, Murray died young. He was only 49. His tombstone remains in the San Luis Obispo Cemetery. Shows a man's hand and a woman's clasped in the word farewell. It's evidence that the two were devoted to each other. And there's evidence that Murray, seen here with his daughter, was a devoted family man. My hunch is he did not want to raise a family in an atmosphere like San Luis Obispo's in 1858. So a posse made up of Vigilance Committee members went after the gang. They located Pio Linares and some Confederates near Turry Road in the Los Osos Valley. There was a 2-day running gunfight. One of the Vigilance Committee members was killed, John Matlock. Linares himself was killed with a shot through the head. Didn't hang Jack Powers, but Powers would get into an argument with another outlaw over a woman in Nogales, and the other outlaw would shoot Powers to death. A 1921 murder in Cayucos would be traced to Chinese immigration to San Luis Obispo County. There were crimes within the Chinese community. The bigger crimes may have been against the Chinese community. Wondering how to explain tongs when I hit upon one of my favorite films, The Godfather Part 2. In this wonderful scene, young Vito Corleone rescues a woman who's been turned out of her apartment, and she gets to keep her dog to boot. In a way, tongs started out the way La Cosa Nostra did. Tongs provided legal assistance, loans, protection for the wave of Chinese laborers that were coming to the United States, including San Francisco and New York. And both types of associations turned into something very sinister instead. Tongs, by the 1870s, had become criminal enterprises. So like La Cosa Nostra, tongs controlled things like prostitution, gambling, and thanks to the forced exportation of Indian poppies into China in the 1830s on the part of Great Britain, they also controlled opium dens in San Francisco. Their membership, their foot soldiers, were overwhelmingly young men. Not all of them were Chinese. There were Caucasian and Filipino members of tongs as well. But of course the vast majority were, like these young men about to be hanged in Arizona for murder, were young Chinese immigrants. But in 1921, tongs demonstrated they had not gone away. They murdered a seaweed fisherman on the beach near Cayucos. A car pulled up. There were 4 men in it, 3 Chinese men, and a white driver who got out and identified himself as a detective. And he wanted the seaweed fisherman to come with him for questioning. The man knew something was up, turned to run, and was shot dead, shot twice in the back. They were said to be, like the gang that had killed the folks at Mission San Miguel, said to be hot-footing it south. Of course, Sheriff Taylor found the car near Sacramento instead. The driver had evidently died, so there went that piece of evidence. And the other 3 participants in the murder simply vanished. The 5 Chinese men who were about to be hanged in Arizona refused to say anything about their handlers. There was kind of an omerta, the same law that governed the Cosa Nostra, don't say anything about anybody. And that probably would have been what Taylor faced as well. So far as I know, the murder of the Cayucos seaweed fisherman was never solved. Yeah, I know that's a chainsaw killer, but the bank robbery during Butter Day in Los Osos in 1892 involved gunny sacks with holes cut out as disguises. I wonder if they didn't put them on backwards, though. It's Butter Day in Cayucos, which is a perfect day to rob a bank because that's when the local dairy farmers make their deposits. And of course, our county, particularly the North Coast, were among the leading dairy producers in the state of California. That cow looks really uncomfortable to me. So lesson one, what seemed like a good idea leads to lesson two. Don't share your good idea with a drunken horse thief. A one-armed deputy, Peter Banks, arrested this horse thief, Peter Dunn, was bringing him back to San Luis Obispo to put him in a jail. When he decided to stop, and out of mercy or maybe curiosity, because he may have thought that the horse thief had something on his mind, they stopped, had a meal, and the deputy plied Dunn with whiskey, and out of Dunn's mouth came plans for the Butter Day bank robbery. So never underestimate a one-armed man. Peter Banks took that news to Sheriff O'Neill, and the Sheriff's Department decided to lay a trap for the bank robbers. They would actually be in the bank the night of the Butter Day bank robbery. Lesson 4, the bank robbers were led inside the bank at nighttime by a citizen posing as a bank officer. They, of course, did not know that Deputy Sheriffs McLeod and Banks were inside the bank, which was then illuminated by a single candle. The candle went out, and I think what happened, especially when McLeod bellowed, "Hands up," was absolute panic. The outlaws opened fire, so did the deputies. One of the outlaws was shot and died the next day. Deputy McLeod was shot twice. He would carry one of the bullets in his body for the rest of his life. The other two outlaws, and Sheriff O'Neill waited at a discreet distance in an alleyway while his deputies, Banks and McLeod, were inside the bank, which instantly reminded me of Marlon Perkins and Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. While Marlon was either playing with an adorable cub or having a Mai Tai back at the club, poor Jim was out fleeing angry elephants. Crime did not pay. The other two bank robbers were eventually caught and sent to the penitentiary. But there is some justice in the world. Sheriff O'Neill was waiting safely outside. His equivalent of Jim, Deputy McLeod, would eventually become the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff. Good for you, McLeod. And the 1892, the century was drawing to a close. There would be a few flurries of activity in our county in the very early 1900s, but it seemed to be relatively stable here until, of course, this happened. Arroyo Grande was no slouch in the saloon department either. We had 6 saloons along Branch Street, the corner of Nevada and Bridge Streets. But the one addition that we had that Cayucos didn't was the town calaboose was in convenient dragging distance. So not a good combination in 1887. Both the victim and the alleged killer were intoxicated. Same was true in 1890 when a body washed ashore. The victim had last been seen with, again, the suspect, and both men were drunk. Sylvester Noella killed Robert Higuera in a drunken squabble in 1894. And in 1904, some out-of-towners were camping at Cayucos. Two of the men in the party went to town with 6 saloons. I can guess what they did. They came back to the camp, got into an argument over a woman, and one of the campers shot the other to death. The anti-alcohol movement had been historically tied to the feminist movement in America, and that's because so many of the victims of alcohol-infused violence were women. So the passage of the Prohibition Amendment in 1920, the impact, of course, would be felt nationwide. This is the day Prohibition took effect in San Luis Obispo. These are citizens deputized by the county sheriff outside the old county courthouse, the 1874 courthouse that would be demolished by Alex Madonna in 1940. What they're doing is breaking individual bottles of beer and pouring the contents down the gutter. You have to wonder what happened to the trout in San Luis Creek that night. And of course, with a tiny police force, Prohibition was exceedingly difficult to enforce in our county. Even when the alcohol mysteriously disappeared from the sheriff's bullpen, the bottles were still there, just the booze inside of them was gone. I would look for someone with a long straw. Of course, the remoteness of our coast made it an easy place to smuggle booze ashore, Canadian whiskey, for example. San Simeon, Cayucos, that's Spooner's Cove near Los Osos on the right, and to the south that's Cave Landing near Avila Beach on the left. All were sites for bootleggers to bring their liquid refreshment on to the shores of San Luis Obispo County, where caravans of trucks would carry it north to San Francisco or south to Los Angeles. The Coast Guard had only 2 cutters. Not only were police forces outnumbered, so was the Coast Guard. They were both surplus World War I Navy vessels, a subchaser on the left, and the so-called cutter on the right was actually a surplus Navy tug, top speed 8 knots. You're not going to catch bootleggers with the tug, which her guardsmen referred to as the Sea Cow. Bootleggers weren't just out-of-towners. We had some local characters who were fairly big-time bootleggers as well. One of them was O.T. Buck, seen on the left, and that's his place, seen on the right. O2 had bought real estate then. Allegedly, Buck would have dispatched trucks north through Cayucos on their way to no less than Hearst Castle. Mr. Hearst, of course, disapproved of alcohol. Marion Davies did not. There she is with Charlie Chaplin, and they're all hoisting drinks that were probably provided by O.T. Buck of Shell Beach, California. Of course, there's one guest in particular. Steve Zegar's taxi would have brought him north to the castle and would have gone through Cayucos. There's one guest in particular who would not have tolerated a dry Hearst Castle, and that would be the man in the center, Winston Churchill. O.T. Buck's was later acquired by Mattie Smyer, where it became a famous restaurant during World War II. Mattie also provided other services to local soldiers. And of course, Mattie's, once upon a time O.T. Buck's, is today McClintock's. Our county has always had interesting guest stars. Of course, the James brothers stayed for a year on Uncle Drury's ranch near Paso Robles. The Dalton brothers visited their brother Bill, who was a rancher in San Miguel, before they went off and got themselves air-conditioned in the attempt to rob two banks at the same time in Coffeyville, Kansas. Well, Prohibition was no exception. This is the Waldorf Pool Hall in Pismo Beach. The man in the Oval, and he was in California in 1928, is allegedly Al Capone. I read a Chicago Tribune article. The reporter recalled that our county was one of his favorite places to smuggle booze ashore. By the way, that place is still around, different name, same windows. It's now the Cool Cat Cafe in Pismo Beach, and they make a very nice hamburger, thank you. Big bust came again near Pismo Beach in 1929. That's Sheriff Jess Lowry. He had a tip about a lumber truck on 101, then 2 lanes, pulled it over and started moving 2x4s aside, and underneath the jackpot there were 200 5-gallon jerry cans full of Canadian whiskey. Good for you, Sheriff Lowry. Unfortunately, violence associated with rum-running came here too. A guy who was just out surf fishing near Pismo Beach was shot dead. There was a gun battle near San Simeon in 1925. One of the participants was then a revenue agent who would later become county sheriff. That's Murray Hathaway. And here is an article about that gun battle. The bootleggers were arrested. And one of the arresting officers was Under Sheriff Emmett Donnelly. And here's Under Sheriff Emmett Donnelly again in a raid on a hotel in Cayucos. Donnelly appears a lot in these raids during Prohibition, and more than once near Cayucos or in Cayucos. He appears again around Christmas time, 1928, at the Motel Inn during a steak dinner there. The Motel Inn, even then, was renowned for its steaks. But he doesn't make an appearance as an undersheriff. He is charged with armed robbery. Fortunately, Donnelly gets a good lawyer, Albert Nelson, the man who had convicted Willie Lewis. And Nelson breaks down witness testimony when they're on the stand. He was very skilled at cross-examination. The jury ruled there was not nearly enough evidence to convict young Donnelly, and the courtroom burst into tears when the not guilty verdict was returned. That was not the end of Emmett Donnelly's troubles. These are cavalrymen near Shell Beach. They're from Camp Atascadero. This is earlier in this century. About the same spot in 1934, there was a column of National Guardsmen marching north. When Emmett Donnelly came barreling down the road, he swerved to avoid hitting them, ran his car into a telephone pole. He had been drinking. 3 years later, he led San Luis Obispo City Police on an 80-mile-per-hour chase through downtown. He eventually bounced onto the football field at San Luis Obispo High School, where the policeman shot the tires out of his car and wounded Donnelly, who survived. He had been drinking. The young man was from a family distinguished by its peace officers, and I can't let go of the fact that Donnelly would, in my mind, redeem himself. He'd been a soldier in World War I, and he would be one in World War II. He was a comparatively elderly, 46, staff sergeant in the United States Army. I don't know what happened to Emmett Donnelly, but for what he did before that alleged robbery at the Motel Inn, he did great service, and I hope the rest of his life was relatively happy.